publish or buy one. She'll show you how she wrote it, the sketches she used, and how it evolved into her book of poetry. Representative Corrine Brown, Florida State of Representatives, House of Representatives in Tallahassee, now working on malpractice insurance for physicians, will be here to speak about politics Florida style, how to be a black female in a good old boy political system in Tallahassee. And that's quite a challenge. And then we have, and I'm trying to think of the fifth one, mine was blank, I'm sorry, getting old. So we'll launch right into Bruce Bridges this morning. Mr. Bridges is celebrated host of the Cultural Awareness Seminar, a Durham, North Carolina popular radio talk show. He's a college professor, bookstore owner, and lecturer. According to one television talk show host in his home in Durham, North Carolina, Bruce Bridges has appeared on my program more than any other person except myself. He is a frequent guest on many other TV and radio programs in the Raleigh-Durham area. He's been honored by the inmates of the Federal Correctional Institution in Butler, North Carolina for a series of lectures designed to develop positive self-awareness. Presently, he's a faculty member of the Department of History and Government at St. Augustine's College and the Department of University Studies at North Carolina State University in Raleigh, North Carolina. Mr. Bruce Bridges. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and I want to thank all of you who came out this morning and who are interested in taking a little time this morning. And there's somebody that has a watch on the front row. Can I borrow it for a minute so I can sort of keep up with our time? Just let me lay it up here. I want to thank you all who found it to be important that you come out this morning, thank you, to listen and learn. Because I was talking to someone earlier this morning, or a couple of people earlier this morning, we find that America is in a grave state of miseducation. And when I say a grave state of miseducation, I mean all people in America, both black and white alike, are for the most part miseducated. And why are we miseducated? We're miseducated in America because most times we don't see the importance of things like Black History Month. And I will be bold enough to say that for the next 40, 45 minutes or so that you'll be here with me, you will probably learn more than you'll learn in the time that you're here in this school. And I say that not in an arrogant manner, but I say that because being a teacher in the school system for some years and being a lecturer around the country and having come into contact with information from various sources, various people, and having been exposed, I have found, as I said before, that America is in a grave state of miseducation. Miseducation when it comes to black awareness, miseducation when it comes to world politics, miseducation when it comes to knowing about her own people and the wants and desires of her own people in this country, miseducation when it comes to respect for other people around the world. And all of this is based on or has its foundation in the fact that we are miseducated. And the colleges and the universities of America, according to a writer of a new book, which is out, by the way, by Alan Bloom, and in that particular book, he talks about how colleges and universities today are basically institutions of propaganda and are not really educating students. And it's my mission wherever I go, and whether or not people tend to like it, but it's my mission to try to, during the short time that I'm on any college or any university, I try to bring about some education, some knowledge, some information, and I think that people are here to learn. This is the number one reason for being in college. Some people who are athletes think that the number one reason is to play football. Some think that the number one reason is to play basketball. Some think that the number one reason is to play tennis. Some think, or many think, that the number one reason is to wear designer clothes. Many think the number one reason is to have a boombox and a Walkman. Many think it's to be popular. But you should always remember, wherever you are, in any school, any university especially, the number one reason for being there is to learn. And I always like to impress that upon students. And this will take you further than any of the other things that I have mentioned. Learning, knowledge, and putting something into your heads. And so this is why I always take what I do very seriously. And I think that it's very important that students attend programs like this, that you listen when you come to programs like this, and that you also come in the frame of mind that I'm here also to learn in the same way that I learn in my classes. I think about Benjamin Mays, who was the president of Morehouse College in Atlanta University. Benjamin Mays will oftentimes have speakers coming to the campus from all across the country, all walks of life, and the men in Morehouse were demanded to be there. They had to come to those programs. Why did they have to come? Because Dr. Mays recognized that learning extends outside the classroom, so much so that he even said himself at one time that maybe you get more outside the classroom than you get within the classroom. So I think about Dr. Mays and his bringing to Morehouse the many speakers and how much you could gain from those speakers. And I also think about my own upbringing and how I grew up and how I actually learned what I know, not in the classroom, but basically on my own and from experiences and been exposed to different people. And had it really been for the classrooms that I was a part of, the universities that I went to, I wouldn't be here speaking this morning. But it's basically because I took it upon myself to learn outside of the textbooks. I recognized that my teachers did not know it all. I recognized that my teachers did not expose me to everything and that I had to do things for myself. So I say this to all the students here in this room this morning. You have to begin to learn outside of textbooks. You have to go beyond the teacher and take it upon yourself to become educated. Because it is not the desire of America to really educate her people. If that were the case, then we wouldn't have to have Black History Month, because Black history would be incorporated into the system, and any chance that there was to bring about a contribution by any person of African descent, and we're talking about Black people, then that particular information would come up. So we wouldn't even have to have Black history. For example, if we were teaching history, then the contributions of Black people will automatically come up, and you wouldn't have to even call it Black history. You might just say that this is a contribution by a Black American, or that Black people were responsible for this, or for these things, or for this particular occurrence of events, and then you could move on. But since America is not interested in educating, but only in educating a certain group about their contributions, then we have programs such as Black History. And then it reminds me of Dr. Carter G. Woodson, who in 1926 fought for and eventually was able to establish what at that time was called Negro History Day. So for one day out of 365 days, there was a chance to spotlight the contributions of Black people in America. Then Dr. Woodson fought very hard, very difficult task, and was eventually able to get the establishment of Negro History Week. And that was still very weak. And now we have Black History Month. So it looks like we're moving, and it looks like we're growing at a pace that, in my opinion, is very slow, but at least there is some movement. But we notice that in order to celebrate the history and the heritage and the culture of the longest living people on the face of the planet in the shortest month of the year is really absurd. And I want you all to think about what I'm saying, and as somebody said to me earlier, what's important is that you challenge the students, and I always try to challenge the students and challenge the teachers as well. But we look at it and we say that to study the history of everybody else for 330 days or so, and to have about 29 or 30 days for the longest living people on the face of the earth, it is, I repeat, absurd. But it's what we deal with, and it's what we're doing here this morning. And it reminds me of the article in Newsweek about 2 or 3 weeks ago. I'm sure some of you all remember it. Archaeologists and anthropologists are beginning to show, and people are beginning to know and to understand, that it was in Africa where man himself originated, and that particular article talked about the fact that Eve was indeed a black woman, if there was an Eve. And these are facts that many people may not want to hear, that many people may not want to recognize, that archaeologists and anthropologists and paleontologists have been saying for many years. People like Dr. Louis Leakey, the renowned anthropologist, his wife, Mary Leakey, the son, Richard Leakey, people like Dr. Broom and Dr. Johansson, and many people have been saying these things. But it is recently that Newsweek has come out with an article saying the same thing. So people are beginning to catch up and are beginning to open up their eyes to the truth of the matter. And it also reminds me of a book by a writer by the name of John G. Jackson. And in that particular book by John Jackson, he says on the first page that this book is dedicated to everyone with an African ancestry, and that includes the whole human race. And everybody is beginning to recognize this today. So when we talk about black history and we talk about black history programs, we're talking about coming to the auditorium, to a classroom, in the same way that you go into a classroom anywhere on this campus, and maybe even more so. So we want to make that very clear this morning at the college as we speak. And I think about how Dr. Woodson, as we go back to him, born in 1875 and died in 1950, son of former slaves, had to work day and night in the coal mines of New Canton, Virginia, where he was born, to become educated and to go to school the next day. And then I think about how today many of us don't even want to go to class for 1 hour, and how this man struggled very hard to get his education. And this is why I also say to students that students should read biographies and autobiographies, read about the lives of men and women around the world, and read about their struggles, and then relate yourself to their struggles and use what they have done as an inspiration for you to do whatever you want to do today. And this is why reading is important, so that you can put yourself in the place of Sister Mary McLeod Bethune, who down in Daytona, Florida, built the Bethune-Cookman College when it was merged with Cookman here in Jacksonville, Florida. Think about how Mary McLeod Bethune, with $1.50 here in your state, started a college on what at that time was a garbage dump. And then we say that today we can't even finish a 2-year school. In a day and a time when, even though there's a great deal of racism in America, at a day and a time when people are doing the kinds of things that are going on in Howard Beach, when people are doing the kinds of things that are going on in Cummings, Georgia, when people are doing the kinds of things that are going on down in Alabama, trying to uphold the Confederate flag, when these kinds of things are going on, yet still there's a chance for people to get as many opportunities as possible out of the United States of America. So we have to read about people like Mary McLeod Bethune and people like Dr. Woodson, who went to Harvard University and received his PhD. And Dr. Woodson became the first or the second black American to receive a PhD from Harvard, second only to Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois. And when he received his PhD from Harvard, Dr. Woodson said that it took me 30 years to get rid of my Harvard education. And then you say, well, everybody is rushing, and I go to Florida Community College, and I go to University of North Florida, and I go to Florida State, and I go to Florida A&M, and I go to all these colleges, and he said it took him 30 years to get rid of his Harvard training. Why, that's why I would love to be at Harvard University if I could. But Dr. Woodson said it took him 30 years to get rid of his Harvard training. What did you mean, Carter G. Woodson, that it took you 30 years to get rid of your Harvard training? He meant that out of all that he had learned in Harvard University, out of all that he had learned at the University of North Florida, out of all that he had learned at the Florida Community College System, out of all that he had learned at the universities of Florida where he had gone, and other schools in America, still he knew nothing about himself. And out of all of thy learning, the first thing that every human being on earth should want to know is about himself or about herself. And then after you begin to know who you are, you can start to learn about other people. And as it goes, charity starts at home and then spreads abroad. So we notice that the president of Yale University talked about when students want to not take Latin anymore because they said Latin is a dead language. It's an old, antiquated language. We don't need to know Latin, the students said at Yale. But the Yale president said that Latin is a part of our proud heritage. And for us to stop talking about Latin or to stop learning Latin would be to denounce our heritage. And so for any people to denounce his or her heritage or her culture is actually absurd and is something that shows disrespect for yourself and for your own people. So all people, whoever you may be, should be proud of your heritage and of your culture and should stand up for it wherever you are in the world. I want to make that very clear this morning in this particular school. Whoever you may be, whether you're of Spanish descent, French descent, Ghanaian descent, Ethiopian descent, Nigerian descent, Indian descent, Korean descent, Japanese, whatever the case may be, all people should be proud of who they are. And so Dr. Woodson says in page 1 of his book, or one of his books, one that I always quote, and everybody in here should read it, it's called The Miseducation of the Negro. Dr. Woodson says on page 1 of that book, and I quote him, he says that the Negro has been taught to admire the Greek, the Hebrew, the Latin, and the Teuton, and to despise the African. I want to repeat that because I don't think y'all heard me. Dr. Woodson said that the Negro has been taught to admire the Greek, the Teuton, the Hebrew, and the Latin, and to despise the African. First sentence. And I'll take it a little further to say that all people in the world have been taught to admire the Greek, the Hebrew, the Latin, and the Teuton, and to despise the African. And why has that been taught? It has been taught, as Woodson says in his book, it's a case of the miseducation of the Negro. Miseducation. So where does this education begin? Where does this history lesson begin that you're getting this morning? In order for us to talk about history and to do it adequately, the contributions of African people in America and all black people in America, whether you like it or not, because you've been taught to despise it, are African people. Let me make that very clear. And I always have to go back to something that Malcolm said to a professor at Harvard University, Malcolm X, when he was speaking there. A professor stood up and argued with Malcolm X many years ago, and he said that, oh no, sir, Malcolm X, oh no, I'm not an African, I'm an American. I'm here, I'm in America, I'm an American. And Malcolm said, I want to ask you a question, Professor, sir. And I asked you the same question, students in this room of African descent, black Americans, who may not think that you're African. Malcolm said, you may be in America, and just because a cat has kittens in an oven, does that make them biscuits? So wherever you are, you take your heritage, your ancestry, and your culture with you. You may be residing in Japan, but if you are of English descent, you are still an Englishman who happens to be in Japan. So if you are of African descent, you are an African who happens to be in America. But we are taught to despise Africa because we don't know Africa. But when you know and understand your heritage and your culture, then you will love who you are. And so we go back now this morning, down to the base of Mount Kilimanjaro in East Africa. We go back to where civilization originated, around the country of Ethiopia. And as a matter of fact, the country of Ethiopia was or is the first country mentioned in the scriptures of your Bible. If you go back and you read your Bible, you will find that the first country mentioned there is the country of Ethiopia. But then when you turn the pages, you don't see anything in there that looks like Ethiopia. I want you to think this morning, and I want you to listen to what I'm saying. I want you to weigh it in your mind. I want you to also remember that I said earlier that all of America has been miseducated. So you see, Ethiopia is the first country mentioned in the Bible, but you turn the pages and you don't see anything that looks like people from Ethiopia. And when you look at the origin of the word Ethiopia, you will see that it comes from two Greek words, Ethios, which means dark, and opes, which means complexion. So Ethiopia then was the people of dark complexion. And that's the first word mentioned in the scriptures of your Bible. But then when you open the Bible and you look at the pictures, you don't see Ethiopian people, but you see people that Michelangelo drew up in 15th century Europe and gave to us. And then after we received it in Europe, and Europe spread around the world, then we have accepted it. And these are facts. Whether we like these facts or not, you're in college and your reason for being here is to be challenged and to learn. And if no one ever challenges what you've been taught, challenges your own philosophy and challenges your belief, then you're not learning. Because whenever you grow, if you notice, things are not always smooth. You fall down before you can walk. You crawl and you stumble and you're pulling up and you're not quite steady until you come onto a firm foundation. So when you come into college, you'll have to be challenged. And that's what we're doing this morning. So it's around the place in East Africa called Ethiopia where we notice that people first of all began to worship God. It was in Ethiopia where monotheism started and people worshiped the one God long before Moses on Mount Sinai. And we learn in Ethiopia, in East Africa, where civilization originated, that people already were great agricultural scientists, knew about the arts, knew about drama, knew about mathematics, and people knew about many of the things that you study in this school today, tomorrow, and as long as you're here. And we learned as Ethiopia grew and Ethiopia became a great nation, and as Ethiopia moved north along the banks of the Nile and people in Ethiopia began to settle in Egypt, we find that Egypt became the fountainhead of the world. And at one time, as I was reading in a book right here in Jacksonville, Florida yesterday at a friend's house, it said that everyone knows that Egypt was the seat of all of the arts and the sciences. And then we say that Egypt is in Africa. But directly or indirectly in the American society, we are not taught that Egypt is a part of Africa. And why do I say that we are not taught that Egypt is a part of Africa? Most of us in America, from reading articles in Newsweek and other educational journals, most of us have no idea of geography. We may know where we are in Jacksonville, but we don't know what's north, what's south, what's east, or what's west. And we definitely don't know anything about outside of America because geography is not emphasized and locations and places are not emphasized in the American educational arena as it once was. But when you look at a map, you will see very clearly that Egypt is on the continent of Africa. And why do I say that we've been taught that Egypt is not a part of Africa? Because every year they show on television a story of Moses and the Ten Commandments. And in the story of Moses and the Ten Commandments, which we all know took place way down in Egypt land, where he said to Pharaoh to let my people go, Egypt land, Africa, look at the map. But then we see that Moses is portrayed by Yul Brynner, and the Pharaoh is played by Charlton Heston. So indirectly now, you're taught that Egypt can't be in Africa because we look at the people on the television program. And then we go further, as I saw on yesterday on Good Morning America, Elizabeth Taylor, for years played the part of Cleopatra, who was a black queen of the Nile. So all of America now is influenced by ABC, NBC, and CBS, and what Walter Cronkite says, and we become miseducated. And it appears that since all of this took place somewhere, and we don't know where it is, and all the people are of European descent, then Africa has made no contributions to the world. And then the miseducation even extends into the finger-popping time. And we listen to Eddie Levert and the OJs, who made a song a while back called Love Train. And some of y'all remember the song Love Train. And he even says in that song that Egypt is not in Africa. There's a line that it says, all you brothers over in Africa. Then it says, tell all the folks in Egypt and Israel too. But when he said all you brothers over in Africa, he had included Egypt, so there was no need to come back and say all you folks in Egypt and Israel too. But most people do not connect Egypt with Africa. But when you study, you will find that Egypt, before it was called Egypt, and by the way, Egypt is a Roman name, Egypt was called Khem, K-H-E-M, which meant land of the blacks. And I see people are taking notes, and that's real good. I see some people in here taking notes, and that's real good. Because all this that I'm saying, I know you cannot remember it. And so it's good that people are taking notes. I'm impressed when I see people taking notes and writing things down. So Eddie Levert and the OJs said that Egypt was not in Africa. Hollywood, ABC Paramount tells us that Egypt is not in Africa. But when you look at a map, and they know you're not going to do that anyway, then we find that Egypt is in Africa. So then out of Egypt, we even get the true picture of the Virgin Mary and the black baby Jesus, which I have pictures of, the Pope who just left here not long ago, that he bows down to and prays to the black Virgin Mary and the black baby Jesus. These are facts. I have books in my bookstore, in my briefcase here with me today, out in the van, that were written in the 1800s by white writers who says that everybody in the world knows that whenever you travel in Spain and Portugal and France and Germany and England, you will find people praying to the black Virgin Mary and the black baby Jesus that came out of Egypt and Ethiopia. But in America, we have received a parquet version, and we think that we have butter. And since parquet is so good and so close to being like butter, and this man sounds like he's telling the truth on this Black History Month program, but then again, I know what I've been taught, and you become confused in your mind, so you're saying that even though he sounds right and that he knows what he's talking about, you're saying it's parquet. No, it's butter. It's parquet. No, it's butter. And you can't really find out in your own mind whether what I'm saying is true or false. So what I want you to do is not to accept anything that I'm saying. And I want you later on to go into a library and study these things. Don't accept anything that anybody says, not just me. If your teacher says something, you should go to the library and check it out and question the teacher. But if you don't know anything, then you can't ask questions. You got to accept everything that somebody tells you. And nobody likes a yes man all the time. Yes, sir. No, sir, boss. Yes, sir, boss. No, sir, boss. Uh-huh. That's right. Uh-huh. But ask questions. And people respect you for that. If you ask questions in a positive manner and be courteous and have your facts and your information, but you have to read and you have to study. So I always challenge students to study. So we find that it was out of Egypt that the knowledge began to spread into Greece and Rome. And then you go into your classrooms and everything is traced back to Greece and traced back to Rome. Because the textbooks that we have in America have omitted the impact of Egypt and Ethiopia on world civilization. So you go into a class in drama, and they say what? Drama originated in Greece. They said drama originated with great people in drama like Euripides and Sophocles and Aeschylus, and you learn all about Agamemnon and Clytemnestra and all these things, and Shakespeare and his sonnets and all these things that are still in my head. But nobody ever tells you that it was in Africa that drama originated. You never learn, for example, that Plato and Aristotle and Socrates and other Greek philosophers, as many writers have said in the books that we don't get, that these men traveled from Greece, and if you look at a map, they traveled from Greece north, south across the Mediterranean and went to school in Egypt and studied under the black priests and priestesses in Egypt, and then learned and took the knowledge that they retained from Africa back into Greece and became great and famous. And they became so great and so famous, or I should say too great and too famous, because their knowledge was too much for the rest of Greek society. And anytime your knowledge is too much and you're too far ahead of the people, then what do? Socrates drank the hemlock. Plato was exiled on an island. Martin Luther King was killed. Malcolm X was killed. Paul Robeson was found in isolation and died a very sad and disheartened man, one of the greatest thespian or actors and greatest speakers and greatest minds of this country. Paul Robeson did because he was too far ahead of the people. Bruce Bridges, and what he's saying is too far ahead of the students, and he's just out of bounds now. So they get rid of you when you're too far. Ask Plato and ask Socrates. When they took that knowledge of Egypt back into Greece and Rome, ask them what happened, and you don't have to ask. You can study your history. We find that Aristotle also went into Egypt with Alexander the Great and went into the great library at Alexandria in Egypt, and Aristotle began to put his name on many of the books that were already written. Many of the thousands of volumes that were in the library at Alexandria, which had the greatest library in ancient times for people to go there and to study. We learned that Aristotle went there and put his name on the books. And then we noticed that the scientists like Democritus, who studied the nature of the atom, we find that he too went to school in Egypt, where people were already studying the atom, where people already knew about the world and the continents and knew that the world was round, long before there was a Christopher Columbus and a Ferdinand Magellan. We find that when you go into a science class, they say that the father of medicine was Hippocrates. How hypocritical. Because when you study Hippocrates, and the sources will tell you this, where I got it from, that Hippocrates went to school in Egypt and learned all about medicine. We find that Hippocrates studied for many years in Egypt and learned about medicine, because there was no nation on the face of the earth which was more advanced than Egypt was in terms of medicine. And we find that there was a man in Egypt who should really be called the father of medicine by the name of Imhotep. I-M-H-O-T-E-P, for those who are taking notes. I-M-H-O-T-E-P, check me out. We find that Imhotep, who lived 2,000 years before Hippocrates, knew about the whole of the human body, the circulation of the blood, how much blood the heart pumped throughout the entire body, knew about the spleen, knew about all of the body parts, the cardiovascular region, all about the medulla oblongata and the cerebrum, the cerebellum, all these things that we learn in class were already being taught in Egypt by Imhotep, the father of medicine, who is also responsible for the saying that we all know, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you may die, which comes from Imhotep, who was called the first multi-genius of history, because he did so many things. He designed the first step pyramid in Egypt, Imhotep did, and was the father of medicine. But when we get our parquet, and we're so proud when we say the Hippocratic Oath, if we go to medical school, we utter the oath of Hippocrates, and we are so proud of Hippocrates, but we know nothing about Imhotep, the teacher of Hippocrates. I may be great, but where did I get it from? I could be fantastic, but how did I learn? And we find that Hippocrates went to school in Egypt. And it goes on and on and on and on. And we find that these people here of African descent built great civilizations in the Indus Valley. They were called the Dravidians in India. They built the cities of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa. Already had use of hot and cold running water, sewer systems, were baking bricks in ovens, building great megalithic monuments that still astound the minds of men. These are contributions that we're talking about of people of African descent. So even if you see us today being coons and buffoons and acting crazy, we must understand that something happened in America to this man of Africa and dropped him from pyramids to ghettos and made him become nothing today. But if you don't understand the history, you'll think that this is the way it's always been. So history is important, extremely important. And then we go into class and we study about the Renaissance, and we study about the great Renaissance of Europe and how Europe came out of her so-called Dark Ages and then moved into the Renaissance. We learn about people in the Renaissance of Europe like Francis Bacon and his four idols in world civilization. We learn about Spinoza, and we learn about Descartes, and we learn about John Locke and his tabula rasa, and we learn about all these things, but no one ever teaches us the origin of the Renaissance. But long before the Renaissance and the Age of Reason in 16th century Europe, we find that there were people from Northwest Africa now on the other side, and this is why geography is important, because if you knew geography, or if you know geography, you can follow me with your minds now. So from Northwest Africa now, there were a group of people called the Moors, who in the 8th century went out of Morocco, from which you get the word Moor. And just north of Morocco is a country called Spain. They went out of Morocco into Spain and Portugal and France and Germany and began to build great civilizations in Europe. And the civilizations built by the people of Northwest Africa called the Moors is really the foundation of the Renaissance. What did the Moors do when they went into Spain and Portugal in the 8th century? They built cities like Cordoba, built cities like Granada, and they built cities like Seville. And today they're called Cordoba, Granada, Seville. But these were great cities of Spain and Portugal, built by the Moors. And the Moors penetrated on up into Europe as far north as France until they were defeated by the armies of Charles Martel. And so they decided to settle into Spain now and to build the greatest civilization that Europe has ever known, the civilization of Spain, the glory of Spain. Paved streets in Spain, or in Cordoba in Spain, when there were none in the rest of Europe. Education was universal in Moorish Spain, when kings and queens of Europe could neither read nor write, and were 99% illiterate. The first schools and libraries were built in Europe by people from the continent of Africa. The first schools were built by the people from the continent of Africa. And then we noticed that these people also knew that the world was round because they had contact with the ancient knowledge out of Egypt. They already knew that the world was round before Ferdinand Magellan sailed around the globe in 1519. They already knew because there was a book written in the middle of the 12th century by a man by the name of El-Idris. And in that book on geography, written by El-Idris, E-L-I-D-R-I-S, two words, E-L one word, and I-D-R-I-S another word. El-Idris wrote a book, and in that book, the following passage appears, and I quote that passage. He says that the world is round as a sphere. This is 300 years now before Ferdinand Magellan. He said that the world is round as a sphere, upon which the waters are adherent and maintained upon its surfaces by natural equilibrium. Then he says that above the earth is an atmosphere, or a layer of air, he says, called an atmosphere. And then he says that the earth draws to itself all that is heavy in the same way that a magnet attracts iron. What else is that? That the earth draws to itself all that is heavy in the same way a magnet attracts iron. That's what? Gravity. But what are we taught? I say we're miseducated. I say we're taught fantasies and fiction and falsehood and Mary had a little lamb kinds of stories. We're taught what? That Isaac Newton was standing under a tree and an apple hit him in the head. He said, oh, that must be gravity. Out of all the thousands of years that coconuts have fallen off trees and leaves have flittered and fluttered to the earth now, nobody knew about gravity until Isaac Newton in 16th century Europe. Come on now, students. But we have been made to accept parquet, and we'd rather have that than have butter. We walk right into the grocery store and go buy oranges and pick up a jar of tang. So we notice that El-Idris knew about gravity long before Isaac Newton. But you don't hear about El-Idris. We use a numbering system 1 through 9 and 0, which were also taken into Europe by the Moors. Because we find that the people in Europe had no system of calculating, no system of mathematics, no system of numbers until Africans went there and gave Europe a system of numbers. And this is why I say, as I said earlier, that it's impossible to do all this in 1 hour, or half hour, or 45 minutes, because it's so much. And I'm just hitting and missing. As a matter of fact, as I look at the watch, as the time is rolling on, as I awakened this morning by my alarm clock, and when the alarm clock went off, I thought about my history. I said, the alarm clock went off, and here is Benjamin Banneker, the black American who invented the first clock in this country. And we all wear watches. Black folk and white folk wear watches. But how many of us knew that Benjamin Banneker was the first man to invent a clock in this country, a black American? Every time you look at your watch, don't always think about Seiko and Elgin and Longines, but think about Benjamin Banneker sometimes. And then we should also think about the fact that Benjamin Banneker designed Washington, D.C., the nation's capital of black America. And then we look a little further after my alarm clock awakened me, I turned on the light. And I look at these lights shining down very hot upon my black face. I thought about the fact that a black American by the name of Lewis Latimer invented the filament for the light bulb, but we all learn about who? Thomas Edison, but we don't know about Lewis Latimer. We don't know that in 1890, Lewis Latimer wrote the first book on electricity in this country. We don't know that Lewis Latimer lit up New York City with his invention of the filament, which is the heart of the light bulb. And then after I jumped up and turned on the light, I went into the shower and turned on the hot and cold running water. And I thought about the fact that my forefathers down by the banks of the Nile had already made use of hot and cold running water. And then I noticed too that after I put on my clothes and finally my shoes, and I looked down at my shoes and I said, here I am walking on my history. And Lewis Latimer, who had invented the light bulb now, who's shining the light on my shoes, who were invented by a black American by the name of Jan Matzeliger, who invented a machine to mass produce shoes in this country. And we all wear shoes. Bostonian and Flowshine and Stacey Adams and Nike and Adidas ought to be thankful to Jan Matzeliger for inventing a machine to mass produce shoes that we all use. And these inventions were or are beneficial to all of the American society. And then, after I put on my shoes, I left the hotel room, and as we were riding here, I looked up at the stoplight, and I said, there's my history again. Garrett A. Morgan, a black American who invented the stoplight. And then I walked into your campus, and I see fire extinguishers everywhere, which you have to have for the fire marshal. Fire extinguishers invented by a man by the name of Thomas Martin. And I see these students here who are very nicely taking notes, and this is very good that they're taking notes. I want you to understand that the pen in your hand was invented in 1890 by a man by the name of W.B. Purvis, who invented the first fountain pen in America. So how can you get away from the history and the contributions of people of African descent? There's no way that you can get away from these things. And so your history is all around you, students, teachers, everywhere. But then we notice that slaves were brought to America after the Moors had built great civilizations and Europeans came into power, and the knowledge of Africa was crushed. And the way in which you make a man or a woman a slave is to take knowledge away from them. When people know who they are and have a proud heritage, then you can't make those people slaves. The people in revolutionary America, the Minutemen and Patrick Henry and the other one, Paul Revere and his Midnight Ride, these people were great men in the history of America, and this is why Americans today are proud, because Paul Revere and Benjamin Franklin and George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, they knew that they could not bow down to King George of England, and they wanted to be free and independent, so they fought the Revolutionary War, because they knew their history and how they had come to America and fought and struggled hard with the Pilgrims and built a country and actually stole it, really, from the Indians, and they were proud of this. And the reason that black people were made into slaves, one of the first things that were done was to take away the knowledge. To say that you're from a savage land, to say that you're from a primitive land, to say that you're from all jungles, and then to show us this on television by way of Jungle Jim, by way of Tarzan, by way of movies like Out of Africa, by way of showing other negative kinds of things in the media then. So this man who was a slave says, oh no, I don't want to see that. I'm not from Africa. Oh no, I see those people from Ethiopia with the protruding bellies. I see the people who are hungry. I see the problems in Africa. So I don't want to be African. I don't want to wear my hair natural because, oh no, there's something wrong with that. But every time you don't wear it natural, Mother Africa in a few days calls it back. Mama Africa calls you back home. So you can't get away from your history. You cannot get away from your culture. But when you're taught to hate yourself and other people are taught to hate you, then you walk around and you think that all you can do is play basketball and football and run track and dance and sing, which is nothing wrong with that. I'm not saying that. But that's not all that you can do. When you understand that you are the father and the mother of mathematics and science and drama and art and everything else that the world studies today, then you would understand that you can do your best here in this school and then leave this 2-year college and go on to a 4-year school and 6 years and postdoctorate or whatever else you want to do, if you know who you are. One man said that history develops the springs and the motives of human action. History develops the springs and motives of human action, and it gives you something that you can take off on and begin to grow and develop in the world. But when you don't know who you are, then you'll follow ads in Essence magazine that say that you can be the woman that you always wanted to be by wearing these new hazel-colored and blue-colored contact lenses when you don't know who you are. But when you know who you are and know your history, and when you study and read, then all people will respect you and you can become great in the world. I want to end with a statement by a West African head of state who is now deceased by the name of Sekou Touré. And he said that a person can leave his or her daughter a house and a fire may come along and burn down the house. A parent can leave his daughter, her son or daughter, thousands of dollars in a bank. Someone may come along and rob the bank. But when you leave your son or your daughter, or when you yourself get knowledge, then that's something that no one can ever take away from you. Thank you very much.
Before you leave, we have a couple of things. Bridges has graciously would like to answer some questions or
Love
answer
to.
some of your questions if you have some. And secondly, we have a reception for him in the provost's office. Donuts, coffee, and things like this. If you have some individual.
And they're all invited to the...
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Good.
We bought another couple of nice.
So I want some questions. I appreciate questions, and before I take questions, I know sometimes students are a little leery about asking questions, but always ask questions. You got to ask questions. That's how you learn. You have to ask questions. Some of y'all remember on television there was a program years ago called Johnny Quest, and Johnny Quest, if you recall, was searching throughout the universe, trying to find different things. He was searching, and so that's where the word Johnny Quest came from the word question. Quest I on. I am on a quest when you ask a question. So they call him Johnny Quest. He was searching. So you should be on a quest, whether your name is Johnny or not. You should be on a quest. So feel free to ask any question. And that's why you're in school. You're on a quest for knowledge. And so if you sit there and don't ask questions, then you can't learn anything. So feel free to ask any questions or something that you'd like me to speak to that I haven't spoken to. If you disagree, feel free to disagree. I'm open to that, and I just want you to express yourself. So if there are any questions, I'll take them. And we got about, maybe 10 minutes maybe for questions, and we'll start with the young lady right here. We'll take them as briefly as we can so we can move on. I see at least 3 or 4. Go right
I
ahead.
wanted to repeat what you said about history develops the
Right, okay.
spring.
Okay, history develops the springs, meaning the spring, okay, and the motives of human action. History develops the springs and motives of human action, meaning that when you understand history, you spring forward, you're motivated, and you have something that you can take off from in order to grow. Springs and motives of human action. So the action comes from the fact that you know who you are. Now, you know, a lot of people don't realize it, but the reason that European society and the reason that white America really does what she does is because all of the lives of white people in America been taught that you've done everything. And anybody who's taught that their mother and their father was great, grandmama was great, and everybody in your whole lineage were great, you're from kings and queens, then you have to achieve. If you don't, somehow it's your own fault. So history develops the springs and the motives. When you're taught that in an early age, you're taught that you did everything, and when you look at billboard signs, you see everything that looks like you. Turn on television, you see everything that looks like you. Comic books, magazines, radio, everything, then you can't help but be great. But when you're showing yourself in a negative light, and when you're taught that your mama wants nothing and your daddy wants nothing, then you ain't gonna be nothing. Then that's what you end up being. Nothing, because that's what you're taught. And we are all creatures of thought. We all move, act, and react based on what we know. And if you know nothing, then you will do nothing. So, in the same way that we grow up our bodies by eating all this crazy food that we eat a lot of time and get big and gain weight and all that, in the same way that we grow up from eating food physically, you grow mentally by feeding your mind. It's the same process, only on another level. So when you feed yourself with knowledge and information, then you can stand before groups of people and you can speak and you can take questions and you are not intimidated. All because you know that you're in shape. You know that you did your push-ups this morning, you did your sit-ups, and you're in good shape and you can deal because you're prepared on a mental level. So this is why I say that you should put as much as you can into your head and learn what you can, and this is the way you prepare yourself. So that answers our question. Other questions now. Let's move on. Okay, right here, and then we'll go to this gentleman.
I want to know why some of our kind of richer African continents don't know about the people down in South Africa with the problems that we're going through.
Okay, good question. Now, South Africa, that's another whole lecture, and it'll take a long time, because what's important about South Africa, which I don't have time to do this morning, is that you understand the history of South Africa, and you ask why other African nations don't do the same thing. You have to understand the history of those nations. But just briefly, you have to understand that South Africa has the second most powerful air force on the face of the earth. They're very powerful military. So the armies of African nations that are nearby still are no match for South Africa. And you also look at the fact that many of these African nations are under neo-colonialism, and their minds are still the minds of Europe, meaning that even though they are blacker skinned, their minds are in the same way that the European mind is. And they don't have even the feelings for South Africa. So that's another thing you have to look at. Also, South Africa being rich and powerful, many of the nations of Africa are dependent upon many goods that are produced in South Africa. So it's a very intricate situation there, a very delicate situation, so it's not as simple as it may sound. But one thing I want to say here, and that is that when you look at South Africa, you will find that South Africa was taken over by the people from Holland called the Dutch in 1652. And at that particular time, the Africans were robbed of their land, robbed of their culture, robbed of their identity. Now, I always make this analysis to people who think that people in South Africa shouldn't be fighting for their freedom, and for people who think that South Africa shouldn't own her land and control her own destiny, especially Americans. I always say that you say nothing when Paul Revere and Patrick Henry fought for this land and how they stood up against the Quartering Act and the Stamp Act and realized that they were being taxed unjustly. That was fine. But when the people of South Africa stand, then it's a different situation. And I also relate this to another thing going on presently, and that is the war over in the Middle East with Palestine and Israel. The people in Palestine are only fighting to get back their land, which was taken by people from Europe who called themselves Jews and have settled in that particular land. That's all it is. But we can't see that. We can see it as fine. And we even make up little stories and glorify. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. And we hear about how the Minutemen could get their muskets ready at a minute's notice. And it's glorified in American history. And it should be, because it's the heritage of a great people trying to be free. But by the same token, why is not Nelson Mandela a hero in the world? Why is not Nelson Mandela and Winnie Mandela and Bishop Tutu and the other Africans in South Africa not also heroes? It's because Europe has defined who are heroes and who are terrorists. What was wrong with the people of Grenada trying to determine their own destiny? It's okay for America, it's okay for Europe, but it's not okay for South Africa, and it's not okay for people in the Philippines. But America has to dictate the policies of the entire world. Why is that? It's because of miseducation. Because throughout our lives in America, we're taught that America is great and powerful and has the ability, and nobody else should dictate to the world but America. Superiority complex. It's just that simple. So, hopefully I answered your question, please. Let's move on because we don't have a couple of minutes. Okay, we want to go here.
You seem to have a very high regard for history. How do you respond to people like Skinner that say that history cannot help us with our problems?
Oh, I disagree. As a matter of fact, I read that in a book that I also had in a band called What They Never Told You in History Class. And when he says it can't help us, I don't agree with that because I think, as you can see from what I've said today, and the history of anything is important. Before you deal with anything, it's good to know a history of that particular person. That's why when they introduce any speaker, that's what they do. They introduce the speaker and tell you something about who's coming before you. If you're going to a doctor and you want a doctor to take care of your problems, you want to know a little history on that doctor. Where he went to school, or how is he? Is he a good doctor? Have you ever gone to him? You want to know somebody's history. Because he's known as a cutthroat doctor, or he's known as a person that really likes to deal with the scalpel and the knife, and later on for trying to heal the problem, just take it out. Or same thing with a dentist, then you don't want to go. So the history of anything is important. That's why when you go to a psychologist, or I should say more so, a psychiatrist, the first thing he does is what? You lay down on the couch, and what does he do? Tell me about your childhood, son. Tell me about your boyhood. How'd you grow up? Because they understand that something happened to you a long time ago that caused you to be as you are today. When you don't understand history, then you believe that the people in Israel own that land that they're on today. But when you look at the history of it, you will find that it was stolen in the same way that South Africa was stolen from the Africans in South Africa. But if you don't know the history, then you look at the present and it doesn't make sense. For example, if I jump off this stage and take this young man here and I, boom, knock him out. Then you say, why in the world did our speaker do that? But if I came in here and I recognized that last night in the Hospitality Inn, he broke into my room, and let's say I had my wife in there, he raped my wife, he killed my daughter, and he got away. And then you'll say, oh, I understand the history. He didn't do enough. But if you don't understand history, you say, I did a terrible thing to this man. So it's important, too, that you understand my history, what I say, and then you can take what I say even better and understand me. So history is important. Okay. Go ahead.
Well, how can you say that we should be proud of people like Paul Revere when they were just stealing the land from the Indians?
No, I'm not saying it should be, but I'm saying Americans are proud because I understand that's what happened. But I'm saying Americans are proud of Paul Revere. But then again, we're not supposed to be proud of Nelson Mandela and Malcolm X, you see. So I'm saying that you should be proud of your heritage and your culture, but that is not something I don't think that you should be proud of. Okay, other questions or comments, real quick. And I'm sure some of y'all have some other questions or comments. Feel free now. No other questions or comments? Okay, let's go right here. Different person. You had one too, I think, too, didn't you?
You made the slang of European mind. Did you define that?
Okay, good. How do I use it? Then I'll define it.
You said,
As control of the world, or how to put it?
you said that it's been known by the European mind, or they've been the ones that have made it that way.
Okay. When I say the European mind, I mean the mind of Europe that controlled and still controls the world and shows everything in the image of Europe, in the image of Spain, Portugal, and England, and Queen Elizabeth, and Victoria, and Prince Charles. This is the way the whole world has been defined, because when you look at history, you'll find that England, though later than Spain and Portugal and some of the other countries of Europe, spread around the world and conquered and colonized other people. And wherever the European mind went, or wherever the Europeans went, when I say European mind, they took what they had learned in Europe from the Moors, omitted the Moors, and then painted everything to suit Europe. All over the world, as an example, you find children who read the story of Robinson Crusoe. Whether it's in America, whether it's in the islands of the Caribbean or the Philippines, you find the story of Robinson Crusoe, which is an English tale, okay, British tale. And you find that story showed England or Europe as being superior. Robinson Crusoe is shipwrecked on an island, and he comes onto the island and he meets a man who is usually black, if it's in an area inhabited by black people, it's in an area inhabited by Japanese or so-called Indians, then he's of that nationality. But Robinson Crusoe begins to control Friday on the island, dictates to everybody on the island. Friday's been there his whole life, and other people, but Robinson Crusoe begins to control. And so what we notice here is that Europe, or the European mind, is beginning to show the indigenous inhabitants who are already there that they are inferior or incapable of governing themselves, and Robinson Crusoe or another European has to govern our island or our land. That's just one small example. You see other examples when you look at things like Dr. Doolittle and the Chocolate Factory and all these little stories that we were taught. These are stories that show that it's Europe or the European mind which is above, superior, and supersedes everything else on earth. And that's what I mean. Even in terms of our educational system, as I said earlier, and I'm sure you can relate to this, everything is traced back to Greece, is it not? We learn all about Greece and Rome, and you know, I've got a whole lot of it, because I can just spout it off because I was taught well. But in a way, that's good, because see, now I'm dealing with a two-edged sword. I know what is taught in the American society, and then I've studied enough on the outside to know what's not taught in the American society. So I'm dealing with a two-edged sword as opposed to somebody that's had the whole European frame of reference and nothing else. Because I know what we Ionic and Doric and Corinthian architecture, we were all taught that, and all taught these things, but we were not taught, as an example, that long before Christianity went into Europe, that Ethiopia is the oldest Christian nation on earth. We were not taught that there were people like Saint Cyprian and Tertullian and Saint Augustine, who were black men who were the founders of Christianity. We were not taught this, you see. We were not taught that the stories of Mary and Joseph and the Christmas story that we have is a story that was told long before there was a Jesus in Egypt in the form of Osiris and Isis. And Isis was the Egyptian goddess of fertility. And from Isis is where you get married. See, well, we're not taught these things. We're taught the fruit, but not the root. And the fruit has been European culture shown to supersede all other cultures on the face of the earth. And that's the European mind. Okay, other questions? We have time? Okay.
Two quick statements and then a question. What you're saying is a subtlety, and what he's saying is a subtlety. I'll give you a fine example. A couple of weeks ago, my wife spends a lot of time taking me to emergency rooms. I fall off the bikes and everything else real easy. And I mentioned to the physician, who was of Lebanese descent, that my wife had been doctoring me all day. And he turned and said, "Oh, she's been nursing you all day." You see the subtlety there? She's a female. She's not enough to be a doctor, but she can be a nurse. A subtlety. Secondly, the God I believe in is colorless. Black, red, green, whatever. Third, now this is my question for you.
Go ahead.
Zulu warriors in the Zulu warrior nation. There's a movie out a long time ago. Michael Caine was in it, about 100 British. He took on 5,000, which I found kind of hard to believe. And everything I read about the Zulu warriors and the Zulu chiefs, they were masters at tacticians, and there are things they studied West Point on their formations and this type of thing. But then you see that in no real history books either. Can you just give us a brief capsule on the Zulu type warriors?
Okay, just briefly, I'll also give you a source, though, so that you can learn more. There's a source that deals with the Zulu warriors. There's something real brief, but to the point. In a set of books called World's Great Men of Color by a writer by the name of J.A. Rogers. World's Great Men of Color by J.A. Rogers. And he talks about, has a section there on Shaka. And there was a movie out on Shaka, right, who was the king of the Zulu warriors. And the Zulus were known for having, as you said, great tactics, and they had at one time what was called, I don't know whether this came out in the movie now because I didn't see it, what was called the bullhorn, okay, where they sort of come together like this. And as you said, they were studied in West Point. The Zulus were early in South Africa, and they fought the British and tried to keep the land for the African people, and eventually they were defeated. And one way in which they were defeated was because of the powerful weapons. And Europeans did have tremendous weapons. So that's just a little information on the Zulu warriors. But J.A. Rogers, World's Great Men of Color, since we don't have much time, is a good source for that. Also, there's a book called The Zulu Nation. I can't remember the author, but you might want to look it up in the library. And two, since you mentioned military, we can point again to Hannibal, the North African general who was at the doors of Rome, who crossed the Alps with elephants, African descent. And he's also studied at West Point, Hannibal. Not to mention the general in Haiti, Toussaint Louverture, who defeated Napoleon and made Haiti become the first nation in America to be independent and self-governing. So it goes on. So if you really want to deal with the military, that's another whole lecture. You could deal with African military geniuses, and there were many. So I mean, it's so much, students, that I could talk about, and it goes on. And one that I always surprise people, a lot of people don't know, Beethoven was of African descent. The musician Beethoven. Oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah. That's true. Oh yeah, I know what happened. I said, that's a fact. Beethoven. And this is according to people who knew Beethoven. Books written by people who knew Beethoven. This is not according to Dr. So-and-so who teaches music here, or professor this or that at that university, but this is by books by people who knew Beethoven and were intimate acquaintances of Beethoven. They described him, you see. But we're taught that he was a German composer. Fine, he was a German composer because he was of German nationality. I am an American speaker, but look at me. I'm an American speaker, but I happen to be here. So Beethoven happened to be in Germany, so he was German, but he was also of African descent. It's just that simple, but we don't ask questions about these things because we're taught subtly or indirectly that if anybody makes any contributions immediately, we don't question it. If it's German, we know it's European mind. But the questions come when you say, oh no, I know Beethoven wasn't black. But we don't question when we're told that he's German. Why? Because you don't question you. You've done everything, so why not this? So these are just little things we can talk about. Thank you very much, and come to the reception.
Black History outlines for anybody needs one of upcoming events.
Yeah.